December 19th, 1941. In a frozen bunker outside Smolensk, General Franz Halder pressed his pen against the thin page of his diary. His hand trembled, not from the cold, but from understanding. For months he had obeyed, calculated, believed. Now, with the Red Army counterattacking and temperatures plunging to 40 below, he finally saw the truth. The Führer had been lying to them all along. He looked at the map pinned to the wall, a sea of red pins spreading westward like blood. It wasn't supposed to be this way. The campaign, Hitler had promised, would last 8 weeks. 6 months later, Germany's greatest army was starving in the snow. The diaries of generals were filling with the same phrase, written again and again. The situation is no longer under control. Halder closed his notebook and stared into the silence. He thought of June, when 3 million men crossed into the Soviet Union. He had stood beside Hitler in the Wolf's Lair, listening as the Führer called the Russian army a pig's bladder that would burst with one prick. Now those same words echoed in Halder's head like madness. He had believed in discipline, in calculation, in numbers. But the numbers had become lies. Hitler's lies weren't shouted. They were whispered, in confident tones, wrapped in certainty, delivered with that cold conviction that made doubt feel like treason. The generals had trusted him once. After all, he had been right before. France had fallen in 6 weeks. Maybe he was right again. But victory in France had been luck. And luck had made Hitler believe he was a god. Now, as frostbite claimed soldiers by the thousands, as fuel froze in the lines, Halder finally understood. Germany was fighting 2 wars, one against the Soviets and one against reality itself. He rose from his chair, stepped to the window and whispered, not to his aides, not to the soldiers dying outside, but to himself. The Führer doesn't see it. He can't see it. And we no longer dare to tell him. That was the night the German General Staff stopped believing. And the night the war stopped being winnable. To understand how one man's delusion consumed an empire, you have to see how the lie spread, carefully, methodically, invisibly. It began long before Russia. Back in 1940, when France collapsed in 6 weeks, Hitler looked at his generals and saw not partners, but witnesses to his genius. They had warned him that the Ardennes plan was reckless. He proved them wrong, or so he believed. That victory planted a seed. If audacity had triumphed once, it would always triumph. If intuition had beaten analysis, then analysis itself was weakness. From that moment, doubt became treason. Inside the Wolf's Lair, maps replaced reason. Red arrows moved where Hitler's finger pointed. Logistics, fuel, rail capacity, numbers were brushed aside. Willpower, he said, is stronger than any statistic. His officers still debated, cautiously, in the margins. General Georg Thomas produced reports. Too little fuel, too few trucks, too long a front. Hitler listened, smiled, and replied, "The Russian colossus is a pig's bladder. Prick it, and it bursts." The room laughed, but Halder did not. He wrote one word in his notebook: insanity. By the spring of 1941, the deception had solidified into doctrine. Every inconvenient truth was recast as cowardice, every warning as defeatism. When intelligence officers reported 150 Soviet divisions, Hitler ordered the figure reduced to 100. Reality was being edited by decree. The generals told themselves it was political theater. A few lies to keep morale high. But Hitler wasn't reassuring them. He was recreating the world. A world where Germany could not lose, where every setback was someone else's fault, where willpower could melt Russian snow. And because he had been right once, they followed him. Again. The invasion began June 22nd, 1941. 3 million men, 600,000 vehicles, 700,000 horses. A war machine powered by faith in a lie. In the first weeks, victory seemed certain. Cities burned, prisoners marched by the 100,000. Hitler's smile returned. "The experts were wrong again," he said. But on the maps in Halder's bunker, the front line stopped moving. Then it began to bend. Then, slowly, it began to break. The web of lies had done its work. The army no longer knew what was true, only what it was allowed to believe. December 1941. The Russian winter arrived like a living thing. It didn't attack with guns or tanks. It attacked with silence, with cold so deep it turned breath to glass and froze rifles to the touch. In the forests around Moscow, the pride of the German army, the same men who had marched through Paris, now burned maps for warmth. They had been promised a campaign of weeks, but it was now 6 months. The supply lines were dead. Fuel froze in barrels. Horses collapsed in the snow. And still, the order came. Advance. No winter uniforms. No retreat. No mercy. General Heinz Guderian begged for permission to pull back, to save his men. Hitler refused. "There will be no winter," he said. "The enemy is finished. One more push, and Moscow will fall." But Moscow did not fall. The Red Army counterattacked with fresh Siberian divisions, men born in the cold, wrapped in white, moving through blizzards like ghosts. German lines shattered. Entire units vanished into the snow. Inside his bunker, Franz Halder recorded the truth in secret. "The army is exhausted. The offensive has failed. The Führer does not understand the situation." Each word was an act of rebellion. Because outside that notebook, no one dared to speak. When the first reports of retreat reached Hitler, he didn't see disaster. He saw betrayal. His rage filled the corridors of the wolf's lair. He shouted that generals were cowards, that defeat existed only in weak minds. So he gave a new order, one that would echo through every frozen trench. No withdrawal, no step back. Hold your ground or die. It was the stand-fast order. Across the front, officers froze at the message. To hold meant death. To retreat meant treason. And still, they obeyed. Halder realized then what few dared admit. The army wasn't fighting for victory anymore. It was fighting for the illusion of Hitler's infallibility. By the time the front stabilized, 800,000 men were dead or missing. 1/4 of the invasion force, gone. But the official reports said otherwise. "Minor setback," they called it. "Temporary reversal." Even disaster was rewritten. And in that rewriting, the last thread of truth snapped. The generals who once doubted now whispered to one another, "He's not leading us anymore. He's destroying us." But still they stayed, bound by oaths, by fear, by the hope that maybe, somehow, the next battle would make sense again. It wouldn't. Because the lies were no longer strategy. They were the foundation of the war itself. August 1942. The Volga River glimmered beneath a burning sky. The city ahead was a maze of smoke, rubble, and shattered glass. Its name, Stalingrad. To Hitler, it wasn't just a city. It was a symbol, a duel of names, his Führer against Stalin himself. And that obsession would destroy everything. The plan, called Case Blue, was meant to seize the oil fields of the Caucasus, the fuel that could keep the German war machine alive. But Hitler divided his forces, half towards the oil, half toward Stalingrad. His generals protested. They knew the rule: never split your army in the field. But Hitler's answer was final. "We can take both. The Russians are finished." He had learned nothing from Moscow. As summer bled into autumn, the Sixth Army advanced into Stalingrad. Block by block, house by house, every factory, every cellar, every ruined street became a battlefield. The Soviets fought like shadows, appearing, vanishing, striking from basements and ruins. German soldiers called it the Rat War. They would fight all day for a single building and lose it by nightfall. In Berlin, Hitler promised victory was near. In reality, his army was being consumed. Manstein, Guderian, and others warned, "Pull back before it's too late." But Hitler didn't want tactics. He wanted myth. "Stalingrad will fall," he declared. "It must fall. Its name alone demands it." So the killing continued. For weeks, then months. By November, frost returned. The Soviet army, rebuilt, reinforced, relentless, launched Operation Uranus. It struck not the Germans directly, but their weaker allies, the Romanians and Hungarians holding the flanks. The line collapsed in days. The trap closed like a steel jaw. Inside the city, 280,000 men of the German Sixth Army were surrounded, cut off from food, fuel, and hope. Hitler's order was simple: hold Stalingrad. At all costs. When air commanders warned that resupply by air was impossible, Hitler smiled. "The Luftwaffe will manage," he said. Another lie, and he knew it. The promised airlifts brought only a fraction of what was needed. Men froze, starved, and fought with bayonets for bread crusts. Horses were eaten, then dogs, then rats. Field Marshal Paulus begged for permission to break out. Hitler refused. Not one step back. Stalingrad must be held. He promoted Paulus to field marshal. No German field marshal had ever surrendered. It was a message: die there, not return. But Paulus didn't die. He surrendered. And in that moment, Hitler's myth of invincibility shattered forever. Of the 280,000 men who entered Stalingrad, only 90,000 were captured alive. Fewer than 6,000 would ever see Germany again. The greatest army in Europe had been swallowed by the city it tried to destroy. And with it, the general's last illusion died too. They finally saw the truth. Hitler wasn't just lying to them anymore. He was lying to himself. The soldiers left behind one simple phrase, scrawled on the ruins of a wall near the Volga. God was with us, but not with him. February 1943. The snow around Stalingrad was still red when the first whispers began. Hitler had promised victory. Instead, he had delivered 200,000 frozen graves. The myth of his infallibility was gone. But in the wolf's lair, the delusion was only growing stronger. He blamed everyone but himself. The generals were defeatists. The soldiers were cowards. The weather, the equipment, even Providence itself, all had failed him. "The German people must toughen themselves," he said. "Weakness will be burned out by fire." His eyes burned when he spoke, not with vision, but with madness. In those moments, the officers around him understood the truth. Hitler no longer commanded reality. He commanded only obedience. Franz Halder's replacement, General Kurt Zeitzler, tried to speak reason. He showed maps, divisions destroyed, fuel gone, men exhausted. Hitler waved them away. Numbers don't fight wars. Faith does. That single line, faith over fact, became the slogan of ruin. In private, some generals began to meet in silence. Men like Beck, Treschow, Stauffenberg, names that would one day echo in history. They spoke in whispers, their words half hope, half treason. He is leading Germany to destruction. We swore an oath to him, but what of our oath to the nation? They began to plan. Not an attack on Russia this time, an attack on the Reich itself. But rebellion came with a price. The Nazi state was watching. Gestapo officers filled every hallway, listening, reporting, erasing. For every general who plotted resistance, 10 others clung tighter to obedience. Some still believed in Hitler's genius. Others simply feared him more than the enemy. And some, the most tragic of all, convinced themselves that staying loyal was the only way to protect their soldiers. To abandon command, they thought, would betray the men still fighting. So they stayed, even as the truth rotted everything around them. In the summer of 1943 came the Battle of Kursk, Hitler's last great gamble. He promised his generals a new miracle, the largest tank battle in history, he said, one blow that will break the Red Army forever. But the Soviets knew. They were waiting. Thousands of German tanks rolled into a trap, fields already mined, skies already filled with Soviet aircraft. By the battle's end, Hitler's miracle had burned into ashes. It was the last time the German army would ever take the offensive in the East, and yet even then he spoke of victory. Even then they listened, some because they still hoped, some because they still feared, and some because admitting the truth would mean admitting that every man who died had died for nothing. The fracture was complete. The army had split in two, those who could still believe, and those who could no longer live with the lie. By 1944, the German Reich was bleeding. Two fronts, endless losses, and a leader who no longer listened to reason. In the bunkers and map rooms of Berlin, a handful of generals reached the same terrifying conclusion. Germany could not be saved with Hitler. It could only be saved from him. Among them was Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg, a soldier, aristocrat, and veteran of North Africa. He had lost an eye, a hand, and 2 fingers to a British bomb. But what remained of him burned with purpose. He had seen too much: villages destroyed, prisoners executed, Hitler's madness turning victory into ruin. He told a friend quietly, "The man who started this war must end it, by force if necessary." And so, a plan began to take shape: Operation Valkyrie. On the surface, Valkyrie was an emergency plan, to mobilize the reserve army in case of civil unrest, but the conspirators rewrote it in secret. If Hitler died, Valkyrie would activate the army to seize control of Berlin, arrest Nazi leaders, and declare a new government to negotiate peace. It was not just a plan, it was a gamble for Germany's soul. The generals divided their roles. Beck would lead the new government. Tresckow coordinated from the front. Stauffenberg, now promoted to Chief of Staff of the Reserve Army, would deliver the bomb. They had tried before: bombs on planes, poisoned wine, malfunctioning detonators. Each failure had cost them friends, each delay thousands more lives. And yet, they persisted. July 20th, 1944. Wolf's Lair, East Prussia. Stauffenberg entered the conference hut with a briefcase under his arm. Inside, 2 pounds of British plastic explosive. He set the case beneath the table, just meters from Hitler. Then, using his one remaining hand, he saluted and walked out. Minutes later, the world shook. The blast ripped the room apart. 4 men died instantly, but not the one they needed. Hitler survived, shielded by a thick oak table leg and sheer luck. Within hours, the Gestapo struck back. Telephones rang across Germany. The coup, half executed, unraveled in chaos. By midnight, it was over. Stauffenberg and his men were arrested, dragged into the courtyard of the War Ministry, and shot beneath the flickering lights of Berlin. His last words were not for Hitler, but for the Germany he hoped would rise again. Long live sacred Germany. In the days that followed, Hitler's revenge was merciless. 5,000 officers, soldiers, and civilians were executed, hung with piano wire, their deaths filmed for his amusement. and with them died the last hope of resistance from within. But even as the hangman's noose tightened, the surviving conspirators wrote letters, journals, confessions that would one day outlive the Reich. They wanted the world to know. They had tried. The bomb failed. The war continued. But that explosion, that single act of defiance, proved that even inside one of history's darkest machines, there were still men willing to say no. April 1945. Berlin, once the capital of an empire, was now a skeleton of fire and dust. Soviet artillery thundered day and night. Buildings collapsed. Civilians fled into basements. And deep beneath the city, in a concrete bunker, Adolf Hitler refused to believe that the war was over. The man who once promised a 1,000-year Reich now ruled over a city that might not last another week. His generals came to him with maps, reports, desperate pleas. They told him the Soviets were only miles away, that the armies he was ordering into battle no longer existed. He stared at the maps in silence. Then, with shaking hands, he drew phantom arrows, counterattacks by divisions that had already been destroyed. "Steiner will strike from the north," he said. "Berlin will be saved." But there was no Steiner. There was no army, only fantasy. For his generals, the few who still dared to speak, this was the moment of final understanding. The lies that had begun in 1941 had devoured everything. Truth, logic, loyalty, even reality itself. Hitler's empire was collapsing, and he was still fighting a war inside his own imagination. Franz Halder, long dismissed and disgraced, was proven right. The war was lost, not to the enemy, but to delusion. Outside, Berlin was dying. Children, the Hitler youth, fought Soviet tanks with rifles too heavy for them to lift. Old men from the Volkssturm marched barefoot through the streets. Every bullet fired now was a monument to denial. Inside the bunker, Hitler raged. He accused his generals of betrayal. He cursed his people for their weakness. He promised new miracle weapons, new divisions, new victories. But everyone around him knew. There was nothing left to save. April 30th, 1945. Soviet troops were only blocks away. The walls shook from explosions above. Hitler gathered what remained of his inner circle. He dictated his final testament, a document blaming everyone but himself, his generals, his allies, his people. Then, at 3:30 in the afternoon, he retired to his room with Eva Braun. Moments later, a single gunshot. The echo of a man who could no longer face the world he had destroyed. Outside, the Red Army raised its flag over the Reichstag. The war in Europe was over. But for the German generals who survived, the real battle was just beginning. The battle for truth. Many would spend the rest of their lives writing memoirs, testifying, explaining, justifying. They said they didn't know, that they had only obeyed, that they were soldiers, not politicians. But deep down, they all knew the truth. They had seen the lies, heard them, believed them, until it was too late to stop them. When Berlin fell, so did the illusion that blind obedience could ever serve a just cause. And from those ashes rose the hardest lesson of all, that truth is not just a weapon of war. It's the only defense against madness. The German generals finally saw the world as it was, not as Hitler wanted it to be. But by then, the price of that clarity was a continent in ruins. History remembers the noise, the bombs, the speeches, the battles. But it also remembers the silence of those who knew the truth and did nothing. This was how the lies ended, not with glory, but with a whisper beneath the rubble of Berlin. When the guns fell silent in 1945, the world was left with a question that still echoes today. How could so many intelligent men, educated, disciplined, and proud, follow lies into destruction? The answer isn't simple. It's not only about politics or ideology, it's about something deeper, the human need to believe, even when belief becomes dangerous. The German generals were not all monsters, but they were men who chose silence when truth demanded courage. And that silence cost millions of lives. History remembers the roar of Hitler's voice. But it's the silence of those who knew better that haunts us still. Every generation faces its own test. Maybe not with bombs and guns, but with truth and lies, and the courage to tell them apart. Because if history has one unchanging lesson, it's this: the moment you stop questioning power, you begin repeating the past. If this story moved you, share it. Because someone out there still believes that truth doesn't matter. Remind them that it always does. And for more untold stories of courage, deception, and the moments that changed history forever, subscribe to WWII Frontline, where history isn't just remembered, it's rebuilt.